Chris Whalen is giving those European stress test results a big ho-hum. Chris is Senior Vice President and Managing Director of Institutional Risk Analytics. He says the lack of bank transparency undermines the credibility of the entire process. Chris is with us this morning with, as usual, Chris, we're glad to say, a very specific point of view. So, Chris, you say who knows, who cares from these European stress tests?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for people to understand this comment at first because they assume that the Europeans have a bank regulatory regime that's similar to ours. But in fact, they don't. There's no transparency in Europe. There's no SEC, no FDIC portals out there with lots of data. So when you look at these stress test results as an analyst, you have no point of departure.
So you don't make anything of the fact that only 7 of 91 passed. You just say it's immaterial.
Well, the whole construct is so opaque that you have no idea how they got there. You see, we don't have regular financial statement data on these banks. When I go to cover Deutsche, because my clients demanded that I do it, I have to go to their website.
All right.
That's it. So we don't have any basis for comparison, whereas even as messed up as the U.S. stress tests were, and they were a political process more than anything else, right? We had already guaranteed their debt, so the crisis was solved. But we had stress tests, and everybody felt better afterwards. But from an analytical perspective, at least the U.S. data that we have available publicly looks something like what was in the stress test results. Whereas with the European banks, this is the first time we've seen numbers on some of these institutions. So, you know what I'm saying? It just doesn't have the credibility with analysts, I think, because we have no means of judging either the inputs or the results.
So, Chris, if you cover Deutsche even ever so reluctantly, I mean, for all of these European banks, the big question, the next question seems to be, if they go to market, if they have to raise billions of dollars, how do they do it? How do they secure long-term funding at a reasonable price? Are you comfortable with just the health, the overall health of the sector?
Well, no, I think it's still a macro story. This is still very much a sovereign story. In other words, when you look at a bank right now, you ask what country is it domiciled in, who is taking responsibility for it. A lot of these credits, you're going to have to assess them as sovereign credits, because these banks are basket cases in many instances. So I think it's going to still be very much of a macro story, and that's a problem because the whole point of the stress test was to try and give the individual institutions some degree of independence, make investors see them as an entity that you could go and comfortably buy the debt and not worry about a sovereign default later on. Now, I don't think any of the European countries are going to default, by the way, but there are different gradations of default. You can have a forced restructuring. We're already seeing this in Europe, where investors are essentially being told that they have to take a haircut. Dubai is another case. So I think what you're going to see with a lot of these banks is forced mergers, restructuring, and the terms may not be good for investors.
Chris, when you talk about the haircuts, excuse me, how much do you think is the difference between what the market is pricing in and sort of the reality of the situation? I mean, we saw, for example, Spain, some people saying it should be about double what it is.
Well, I would agree with that. The Spanish have been very aggressive in hiding their problems. There's a lot of asset quality problems in Spanish banks. This becomes a European problem because the Germans and the French hold their debt. They are funding the Spanish banking system. It's much like what we did with subprime, Deirdre. We had core deposits in banks funding about 2/3 of it, and the other third was funded off the market. So when things went bad, the market funding evaporated overnight. So that was part of the reason we had the crisis. Spanish are the same way. They're misfunded, with the rest of Europe holding their paper. That's why it's a German problem.
Which gets us back to this idea of it being macro-driven. Chris, if you had to give just one word of advice to investors, what would it be right now as far as the European banks go?
Well, remember that these are ultimately sovereign credits. UK, France, much of Southern Europe, Italy. The state is the player. It's not the private corporation anymore, and that's a problem.
Chris, we thank you as always.